The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. Lovin' baseball when we were 12 and innocent. Great subject, great guest today, Steve Treder. Welcome to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
Awesome to be here.
Oh, awesome to have you, my friend. San Francisco born and raised, I understand.
Well, not San Francisco per se, Santa Clara, but San Francisco Giants fan from my earliest days.
Your earliest days included age 12, no doubt. And I pick age 12 because it's when intellect meets passion for a kid.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
That has long been one of my central organizing principles of life, that you can understand almost everything about somebody by knowing what was going on the summer that they were 12 or the year that they were 12. Because not only baseball or other sports are you're never a more pure, sincere, intense fan of anything as you are when you're 12, but also movies, TV shows, music. When you're 12, you're really, for the first time, I think, really starting to really understand things like that, how to consume art. And boy, you get hard beliefs and loves and passions that will stay with you for the rest of your life. I was 12 in 1970. That was the summer I turned 12, and the baseball season of 1970, and the ones around it, 69, 71. That's my sweet spot. I can tell you every possible minute detail about the baseball seasons in that era.
So you know, of course, that it was the year before the summer of the Fox, the year of the Fox. And
you're talking about Charlie Fox?
Charlie Fox, who managed the 1971 team. With gusto. He had the guts to play Spire and Fuentes in the same infield, and he risked his job to do so, and that team overachieved. So you were lucky to be a kid in those years and soak it all in. Who was your favorite Giant to watch, besides Willie Mays? Let's do the Willie Mays caveat. Of course, it was Willie Mays, but that's a separate category. All right. When I was really young, before 1970, my favorite Giants were first Cap Peterson, and then following him, Ollie Brown. I think because I identified with both of them because they weren't stars. They were obscure young players, trying to make it. And as a little kid, the littlest guy, I kind of identified with them. By 1970 or so, I think my favorite player was probably Bobby Bonds. Okay. You have in your mind then the picture of Mays and Bonds going up for a fly ball against that fence, and Mays coming down with the ball. But that's a great picture of two wonderful athletes. Bobby Bonds, people lose sight of the fact of just how good he was. His natural talent was incredible, and I think he, if I'm not mistaken, had some substance abuse problems of his own, and led to, as someone who I became a Mets fan when they were born, but I right after that moved to the Bay Area, so I got to follow them, the Giants. I know downtown Ollie Brown and Cappy Peterson very well. They have great in the Giant lore for different reasons.
But in 71, getting back to 71, Mays was still Mays, and great memories of those days. Ollie Brown was one of the outfielders that the Giants were very rich with. It went back to Kirkland and Wagner and all these guys coming up in the Giant organization. And I think what curtailed Brown wasn't Matthews and Maddox coming up around that time as well.
By the time they came up, Brown was gone. Brown had the misfortune of being a right fielder, and he had a cannon arm. He had if not the best right field arm in baseball, then one of the very best right field arms in baseball. But coming up right behind him was Bobby Bonds, who didn't throw like Ollie Brown, but did everything else better, of course, because as you said, he was just an amazingly all-around talented player. And on any other, or just about any other team in baseball, Bobby Bonds would have been a center fielder. He was a center fielder in the minors. But, of course, they had Mays, and so that meant that Bonds became a right fielder, and that was what crowded out Ollie Brown. And so the Giants let Brown go in the expansion draft in October of '68. They let him go to the Padres.
I know the Giants had Henderson, and he was entrenched in left field, and he was very solid. Do you remember?
A terrific all-around player. He didn't do any one thing brilliantly, but he did every little thing well. He was very well-rounded.
Right. They were always rich in outfielders, and it was interesting. Later on, Maddox, as we talked about, and Matthews took over. It was nice being a Giant fan for a lot of reasons, but it wasn't your history of being a Giant fan was interrupted 2 or 3 times when there was a real chance of them moving. How old were you when those threats came down?
Yeah, there were 2 junctures at which the Giants were really, really close. I mean, inches away from moving away. The first was in 1975, 76, actually, when Horace Stoneham was on the brink of bankruptcy and forced to sell the team. And he wanted to sell the team to somebody who would keep them in San Francisco. That was certainly his desire. But he needed to sell. He couldn't wait forever. And the first offer that came through that met his price was from a group that was going to move the Giants to Toronto. And this is in the spring of '76. And they were, it literally came down to the deadline that the league had set before the season opened, and they had to resolve this. On that very day, a phone call came through to Bob Lurie, who was a local guy who wanted to buy the team but didn't have enough capital. And some stranger that nobody had ever heard of from Phoenix, Arizona, named Bud Herseth, called up and said, I'll put in the other...
A cattle rancher.
A cattle rancher, yes, and a wild character. And he put up the other $4 million, and he and Lurie bought the team. And literally, with minutes to go before the league was going to award the franchise to Toronto, they awarded it instead to the Lurie Herseth purchase, and the team stayed in San Francisco.
Well, now you said the magic word a few minutes ago, Stoneham. Horace Stoneham. You wrote a recently released book about Horace Stoneham. Tell me the title and the history behind that, if you would.
I'd be delighted to. The title is 40 Years a Giant, The Life of Horace Stoneham. It's published by the University of Nebraska Press. The official publication date is June 1st, but I happen to know for a fact that it is printed and being delivered to those who have already ordered it, because I'm one of them and I have my copy.
Oh, wow.
The history behind the book is, I think, as we've covered here, I've been a Giants fan all my life, and so I knew about Horace Stoneham since the 1960s when I was a kid. He was the owner of the team. he was, known as the owner. He was famous in that regard, but that was it. He never brought attention to himself. He never did interviews. Was very rarely quoted in the press. He was very happy to be in the background, and so he wasn't prominent at all. Unlike his contemporaries, people like Walter O'Malley and Bill Veeck and Charlie Finley, who were very prominent. Stoneham was none of that. He was very shy and self-effacing. He didn't want to be in the public eye. So I knew who he was, but didn't really know much about him because nobody did. And then I knew the story of him having to sell in the 70s. Obviously, we all read about that. But I didn't really think much about him until later years in becoming more of a serious baseball historian and researcher and starting to really learn about the franchise and the story behind him, and began to understand that he was quite a remarkable figure in baseball history. He didn't bring attention to himself, but he did a lot of important things. Among other things, he owned the franchise for 40 years, which is a long time to own a franchise. And he owned them through a period of extraordinary change in Major League Baseball and the world of sports in general. So, he built the farm system, he racially integrated the team, and he moved them across the country. He had very big decisions to make, and he made them. So he was an important guy. And the other thing about Stoneham is that unlike most owners, unlike, let's say, Walter O'Malley or Tom Yawkey, or Phil Wrigley, or so many others, he wasn't just the owner. He was also the general manager. Stoneham didn't just own the team and write the checks. He made the trades. He called up the rookies from minors and sent the guys down. He fashioned the roster. He did everything himself, which was really, really, by the time he was doing it, was extremely unusual. So he has to be understood not just as an owner, but also as a general manager, as one of the competitors for championships, along with Buzzy Bavasi and George Weiss and all the other general managers of his era. He was one of those guys, too. So it's a remarkable story. And the Giants, of course, have a very storied history, a remarkable history of Mel Ott and Leo DeRocher and Bobby Thompson and Willie Mays and Juan Marichal and Willie McCovey. All those guys, those were Stoneham's guys, and it's a. They
were Stoneham guys. Chub Feeney really helped him.
Chub Feeney was his right-hand man. He was his nephew. Chub Feeney was kind of Stoneham's ward a little bit. He wasn't an orphan exactly, but he had a difficult childhood, so Stoneham let him. Actually, it was Stoneham's dad who was the owner at the time. They hired Chub to be the bat boy when he was a kid, and then after Chub Feeney went to the Navy in World War II and then got his law degree at Dartmouth, Horace hired him to be the team's. His title was general manager, but he was never the general manager in the sense that we understand it in baseball. But he was the operational manager. He executed Horace Stoneham's, orders and ran the operation for 30 years until he became the president of the National League.
Right, and he later passed on some good genes. Katie Feeney was big in the National League commissioner's office for a lot of years.
She was indeed.
Died.
Yes,
she died.
She sadly died. I had a chance to interview her for this book a few years ago. She was Chubb's daughter, and had lots of interesting things to say about her father and her Uncle Horace.
Okay, I want to talk something that occurred to me that would interest you. I want to talk about the best trades that Horace ever made and the worst trades Horace ever made. Now,
that's a great topic.
Right? I've been doing this a while, being a Giant fan. I mean, in 1940, must have been 1947 or 8, the Giants made a deal with the then Boston Braves, where They had a bunch of guys. I can't think of any of them offhand. Power hitting guys that were over the hill, clogging up the bases. And Horace hires Leo DeRocher, and Leo DeRocher says, back up the truck. And what he meant by that, get rid of all those who weren't helping you. And two of the players that they got were Alvin Dog and Eddie Stanky. Now, Alvin Dog was right in his prime. Eddie Stanky was over the hill a little bit, but he was a winner. And they formed the nucleus of the 51 championship. And Doc was still there in 54 when they won it all. So I contend that that was the best trade that they ever made. Am I somewhat?
It's a strong contender. The actual date of the trade was December 14th of 1949. You're exactly right. It was the Giants and the Braves, and it was a huge deal. It was a blockbuster deal. The Giants traded Willard Marshall and Sid Gordon, who were two power-hitting outfielders, although Gordon could also play third base, and he was playing third base for the Giants at the time. They weren't over the hill. They were both still in their primes. Right?
Oh, okay.
They were slow runners, but they were outstanding hitters. They were both terrific hitters, and they were still in their prime. They weren't over the hill. But you're exactly right. It was a way of refocusing the core strength of the team from middle of the order power to middle of the infield defense and getting on base. And Stanky and Dark were both, a huge upgrade to the team in the middle infield. Stanky had one great year left in him in 1950 and then began to fade. Dark, as you say, had 5 really good years in him. He was one of the top shortstops in baseball for a while. So it refashioned the team and made room for other guys to come in. And one of them was named Willie Mays to fill in the spots that.
Yeah, he was good.
Yeah, he could play a little bit. So it was a great trade by Stone. I mean, DeRocher certainly urged him to do it, but it was Stone who negotiated the deal. The other deal, very similar to that one, also with the Braves, made in February of '54, was to trade yet another power-hitting outfielder the Giants had, a guy by the name of Bobby Thompson,
to the
Braves. For Johnny Antonelli, who was a young, very highly promising young pitcher who hadn't quite busted out yet. He had potential but hadn't broken through as a star. Well, as soon as he arrives with the Giants in '54, he busts out as a huge star. If there had been a Cy Young Award in 1954, at least in the National League, Antonelli absolutely would have won it. He was brilliant for them. They would not have won the pennant in '54 were it not for that trade. It was hugely important, and Antonelli remained a top starter for the Giants for the rest of the 50s. That was a great trade by Stoneham.
Now, you were out here when the Giants moved. Johnny Antonelli and the San Francisco Giant fans didn't see eye to eye. What was behind that?
Antonelli was a New York guy. He was a native New Yorker. And, of course, the fans in New York loved him. I don't think he was terribly eager about moving all the way across the country to San Francisco, but he performed well. He pitched very well for the Giants in '58 and '59. There was an incident, there was an incident in 1950, I think it was '59, it could have been '58, when he was pitching at Seal Stadium, which was the temporary stadium the Giants had. And he gave up a home run to win or to lose a game in the late innings that he felt was a cheap home run. The wind blew it, and he didn't think it was a legit home run, and he complained about them playing in this substandard ballpark. That did not go over well with San Francisco fans, and so they never really forgave him for that. But he performed well for the Giants, and then in 1960 he began to decline, and they. After the end of the 1960 season, Stoneham traded him along with Willie Kirkland to Cleveland for Harvey Keene.
Oh, Willie Kirkland. I remember him very well. And I remember how Harvey Keene was instrumental in 1962. They would not have won in 62 in the same way that you're right about Antonelli in 1954. So baseball is an incredible thing in that way. It weaves in and out, and boy, you're an interesting guy to talk to. What was the worst trade your Giants ever made?
Oh, unfortunately, there's a long list to consider here. But I think the very worst trade that Horace Stoneham made was in November 1971 when he traded Gaylord Perry to the Cleveland Indians for Sam McDowell. The logic of the deal was that Perry was 33 and McDowell was 29, and so that Stoneham's logic was that Perry, had been a great pitcher for many years, but he was 33. Clearly, he was going to be beginning to decline, and so before he went downhill, while he still could command some market value, Stoneham figured he'd trade him in for a younger top star pitcher, Sam McDowell, who was only 29. The problem with that logic was that although McDowell was 29 years old, he was also a raging alcoholic, out of control alcoholic, and was really beginning to just about to lose his capacity to maintain his composure and play baseball. And the Giants got McDowell just in time for him to completely collapse. While Perry, seemingly ageless, gets a second wind, wins the Cy Young Award in 1972. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And goes on to win, I don't know how many wins did Perry have, 300 or something, and goes to the Hall of Fame. A terrible trade.
Hey, Steve, I'd like to thank you for a second for taking over the coughing duties that I do so
somebody's got to do it.
And very well.
Somebody's got to do it.
I know, and we do it, and we're Hall of Famers for that. That's podcast radio. You get what you get, and I'll tell you what we're getting today. Steve Treder, one of the most interesting Giant fans I've ever come across out here. You have a young voice too, and that's important.
Until it collapses in a coughing fit. Thank you.
Okay. Well, keep it up. What would something you tell a 12-year-old rooting today? What would you tell them what to expect in baseball? Because it becomes, you lose your innocence at 12. That's why I named the show when we were young and innocent. How did you lose your innocence, and what was that about? And you can that's an open question.
Sure. Yeah, there is a certain innocence that we all have when we're about that age, and yeah, it doesn't last. I guess for me, I was 12 years old, as I said before, in 1970, which meant that it was as the 1970s advanced that I became a teenager and then a young adult, and the 1970s were a rough decade. The 1970s were not a good time for the United States. You have the losing of the war in Vietnam and the oil crisis, and interest rates were just soaring, and the economy was in tatters. It was a tough time, and so a lot of the innocent, illusions that I had been brought up to believe in the 1960s about how, America is great and everything is always going to get better, and those kind of fell apart pretty quickly in the 1970s. And in the Bay Area in the 1970s, you've got Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army, and there was there were bombings, there was terrorist activity. It was, bank robberies. It was a rough period. So by 1976 or 78, I had lost my innocence. I'm sorry.
Can you honestly say for a second? Let me interrupt. That things were anywhere anywhere near as screwed up, say, as they are today. Is this?
They were a different kind of screwed up. They were a different kind of screwed up. I think, yes, I definitely, at least certainly within the last 5 or 10 years in the United States, we have entered a really dark and dangerous period. We are at this point in United States history, we're at the most severe crisis of American democracy since the Civil War. This is rough stuff we're dealing with right now. It would be hard for any 12-year-old now to have any kind of innocence left. But sports. One of the good things about sports is it is kind of a escape. I don't mean that you can literally ever divorce sports from political reality, but it's a kind of a way that you just for at least for a couple hours forget all that stuff and focus on the game. And it's a meritocracy, in sports, at least if it's done right. The best player wins.
Back in the day, it was an escape.
Yeah.
Now
the best player wins, the best team wins. There are rules that everybody has to follow, and so it's fair. And if you lose, you can't say, I didn't know. You knew. This is the rules. This is how we score, and this is how you win. This is how you lose. Baseball and all sports, I think, are a good way for one to be passionate about effort and dedication and discipline and focus. I would tell this for kids about baseball. Baseball's hard. Baseball isn't easy to play. Baseball's hard to play. Baseball, even the very best players fail more often than they succeed. It's pitiless. It doesn't care if you aren't good. It's going to punish you. It's a really good way of sort of
adjustments. You will soon fade.
Yes, it's a hard master, and even the very, very best players who are stars at various levels of baseball, will tell you that it's a harsh mistress. It will make you suffer. It's a really difficult discipline in that way. Every sport is, but baseball has its own particular strength in that way, in that it's an everyday affair. A baseball player plays all summer for 6 months every day, and it's a real hard grind. Following baseball as a fan, it's a grind as well. You follow every game. You don't just pay attention once in a while. You listen on the radio, you watch on TV, you read about it in the newspaper or whatever. Nowadays, you follow it on the internet. You pay attention. You know exactly where the team is playing. You know who's in the lineup. You know who's doing well, who's not. It's really an intimate commitment to go with this team through thick or thin. Again, usually you lose. Usually your team doesn't win the pennant. That's part of the game. It's really special when they win because it's hard, because it doesn't happen all the time. I was rewarded as a Giants fan. I was rewarded in 2010, 12, and 14 with World Series championships, which I've got money in the bank for the rest of my life. Because as of 2009, I'm thinking I may never get this. I may never ever. May die, never knowing what it's like to have the final game of the season be a winning game for my team.
Think of the years between 1954 and 2009. I mean, that's a
long time.
A long time. A lot of frustration. Hey, Steve, what a terrific interview. Would you promise me that you'll come back sometime?
Oh, it's my great pleasure. That you're a fun guy to talk to. This is really, really a good format and an interesting conversation anytime.
Wonderful, Steve. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Steve Treder is the guest. And as I promised, I had fun. That's what we talked about before. Let's keep it fun. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Adios and happy trails.
Bye-bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.